Welcome to Behind the Ticker, the podcast where we go beyond the symbol and into the strategy. I'm Brad Roth, founder and chief investment officer at Thor Funds, and in each episode, I sit down with ETF managers, CIOs, and industry leaders to break down how these funds are actually built, how they behave in real markets, and how advisors use them in real portfolios. Most people just see a ticker symbol, but we know much more goes on behind the ticker. Hey, Bill, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So before we get started, why don't you talk everybody through how you got to Rex? I'm sure there is a career path there. And so what is that career path that led you to eventually take on your role here at Rex?
Sure. So my background is in the equity research space, mainly on the buy side for a series of different hedge funds in and around New York. I've been kind of a deep in the weeds fundamentalist equity research guy, for most of my career, and kind of in the late 20-teens, early 2020s, I had the opportunity to jump over to Rex to help them build out a suite of crypto products. Actually, I had some interest in that space for a long time, and they were looking for someone to do kind of deep dive research and build out that capability. And that's since kind of morphed into a more broader research role at Rex, where I am responsible for just looking into the future, trying to find new and emerging ways to get investors exposures to kind of interesting and profitable funds.
So before we get kind of too deep into Rex and the lineup, and we're going to be talking drones today, what do you like to do for fun when you're not working?
Well, I'm recently an empty nester. My wife and our last child went off to college this fall, and so I'm kind of rediscovering how to spend time for myself, which has been sorely lacking over the last, say, decade or so. I'm a lifelong ice hockey player. I grew up playing in the Midwest, and so I've been playing in men's leagues here in Connecticut probably my entire adult life. So when I can get away, and it kind of dovetails well because most ice time for adults is like 11 o'clock at night. So I'm that guy who's out pounding the boards at 1 a.m, and then coming home half hyped up, can't get to sleep. But yeah, that's what I like to do for fun.
You're braver than me. I put the skates up, and I played maybe men's league for a year, and I'm like, I enjoy my MCLs and my ACLs too much, and so you're a brave man for staying on the ice.
It's rough on the system. I've had a few unfortunate injuries, but I refuse to give it up despite my wife pleading with me to move on.
It's funny. You're empty nesting, and I just signed my 4-year-old, soon to be 5-year-old, up for hockey. So we are. I'm just getting restarted. So I'm sure I'll be back on the ice here pretty shortly, coaching with a whistle.
Yeah, you are on the front end of the curve. I'm jealous. That's awesome. Good for you.
So Rex started with the T-Rex leverage products and micro sectors. Now you've got spot Solana, you've got XRP ETFs with staking, you've got income options, you've got Bitcoin convertible bonds. What is the unifying philosophy over at Rex? There has to be some through line, or are you just trying to, as you kind of said, see where the future's going and try to create product for that?
Yeah, I think that's a good starting point. We're just trying to give traders and investors what they want. And so we listen to the market. We're very in tune with kind of what the retail flow is looking for, where they like to, find edge. Leverage is obviously, as you say, a big component of that. We're always trying to add leverage to the system to, again, give traders with conviction the ability to express that conviction at a higher level. And then some of the stuff that we've been doing has tried to kind of round out the portfolio for individual investors. We have some growth and income products, the covered call suite. We have an auto callable note fund that we've just put out. And we are now, like you say, moving into the thematic space, with this drones ETF, which has been a real hit for us. People seem to really like the idea of a pure play drones, exposed fund. And so we're happy with how it's come out into the market and the reception it's gotten.
Yeah, I want to talk about drones here in a second. I wanted to ask though, it's interesting. You guys launched spot Solana and XRP ETFs with staking before most issuers even had their filings in. How are you getting these things, or how are you viewing kind of the regulatory process over there of kind of, I guess, taking swings and seeing if, I don't want to say allowed to get a product to market, but I mean, these are new pioneering products. And so it has to be a little bit more difficult than most products to actually get out there.
Indeed. I think our underlying philosophy is to um, push the limits of where we think that the market wants to go and try to give, investors what they want. And if that requires us going to the SEC, which it did in the case of Solana and our ESK staking product, like you say, it's the first in the market to offer staking. We just think that was an important piece of the crypto ecosystem. A lot of 33X funds, were not allowed to do that. And if you're interested in crypto, that, for these proof of stake protocols, staking, generates yield that offsets the dilution of some of the issuance in these particular protocols. So, if a protocol is issuing 2 to 5% and you can offset with staking, you're just well ahead of the game. And not only that, but it also is the kind of crypto native way of securing the network. I mean, everyone who stakes token basically is participating in the security of that network, which we thought was an important message, for the product. But we just have a very strong legal team that is very good at, engaging with the SEC and working through their concerns and making sure that we do right by the investor in terms of protections. These funds are 40 Act funds. So we were able to get that structure in the market. We're the only ones that offer crypto in a 40 Act wrapper that allows you to essentially bypass the K1. You get a 1099, you get investor protections, and you get the added, enhanced staking features. So we're happy with it. Wish the crypto market was a little bit better, but in general, we keep pushing forward with things like that.
So let's get into drones. Ticker is DRNZ. You guys launched it in late, I guess, 2025. It's the Rex drone ETF. It is the only pure play drone and UAV fund kind of on the market. What made you look at this space and say this particular sector needs its own product?
So when you look at kind of the drones exposure in the market, the only real way that people were getting it was through military specific ETFs. And just looking at the construction of those ETFs, there's nothing wrong with them. Just the simple fact was that we thought that drones had more interesting use cases that were not being exposed in those particular funds. And so you were buying a lot of legacy defense systems and just pure aerospace in order to get the fastest growing piece of it, which wasn't just really showing up in the performance. And so we thought, it would be much better to construct a fund that really captured the kind of additional and emerging use cases of drones, as well as just the pure play nature of it in defense. I mean, we have a very strong thesis that, drones represent such a major shift in defense technology. It's almost worth being an exclusive piece of the fund than it is to worry about, missiles and ships and stuff like that.
So the investable universe for drones is a little bit tricky. So your screen requires companies to derive at least 50% of their revenue from drones or UAV enabling tech. So how hard is it to actually run that filter? And are you finding enough names in the universe that, the universe is pretty thin. I mean, it is newer. So
yeah, and we have a market cap cutoff of $100 million, as well as some other additional liquidity screens that go into it. Thankfully, we have a very strong partner with VettaFi. They are our index calc agent and, index construction partner. They do an amazing job of kind of scouring the universe to make sure that, any and all constituents that meet these requirements are being, captured. It's a global fund. And so I think if you look at kind of the breakdown of the constituents right now, it's probably about, 50-ish% North American, maybe a little bit higher than that. We have some Chinese ADR exposure. We have European exposure. There's a big Australian piece given the kind of nascent counter drone technology sector that's been growing in that country. So we like the fact that you can get global exposure through this fund as well. And I believe about 20% of it still is legacy aerospace and defense. So, to the extent that RTX or someone else might have drone exposure in one of their segments, if it meets the criteria, then that also gets captured in the ETF as well.
So let's stay on the index construction because you've got about 43 holdings the last time I've looked. They're diversified buckets with weight caps. So pure plays, if I understand it, can go up to 15%. Diversified, if you could define that for me, maxes out at 5. So can you talk me through, the index and, why is it working this way rather than just equal weight, or, I guess trying to do some sort of active approach to picking the best names, right? So walk me through the index construction just a little deeper if you could.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to go off your point about what diversified is, I mean, that's essentially, if it's not a pure play, again, like to use the defense example, if it has about 20% of its revenue from drones, UAV, enabling tech, manufacturing, or R&D, then is considered to be, part of the diversified bucket, and then can meet that specific criteria. And again, the goal was not to exclude defense. It was to try to capture the defense companies that had the most drone exposure kind of in their portfolio. And then, to kind of broaden out why the modified market cap. I think if you look at this space over time, we would argue that it's still in that ultra competitive, highly Darwinian, very nascent emerging technology. And in that case, then we don't want one particular constituent that might have, kind of an early lead to essentially hog the cap of the performance or the performance space. If you look back, the turnover of leadership in this area has been, pretty dramatic. And so you're going to have a company that goes from zero to $1 billion of backlog, with a defense award in a year. It can shoot up the cap table pretty quickly. So we want to make sure that investors capture that performance. So we tilt towards some of the smaller caps that can emerge quickly, and allow them to perform inside the portfolio, which I think is a more pure kind of expression of the theme. And you'll see, names fall out of the portfolio pretty quickly as well. And so we'd rather have that kind of environment. We'd rather have the market take away the bias from you, the investor, and, the ability to keep on top of, 100 different drones names. As a former equity research analyst since I've had fun, it's a lot of work to, to stay current in any particular name. And so this index does a lot of that work for you.
So you actually walked me directly into my next question. I mean, the news cycle, if you're paying attention to drones, it is a wild news cycle, right? Like, you got a company like Swarmer who IPOs at $5, hits $55 in like 48 hours.
There you go.
There's so many stories like that out there. So how do you keep up with this velocity, and like, how does it change how you think about rebalancing this fund? Because it changes day by day, week by week sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, that is the beauty of the indexing methodology, is that, you may not capture the first 100 million of the market cap move in that particular, scenario where it goes from 5 to 50, but you will get, a piece of that action as it moves up into the table. And, the fund rebalance is periodic enough that I think you do, manage to capture a lot of that news flow that you mentioned. Other piece of this puzzle is that we want to make sure that it's not just defense demand that's driving, the drone story. I think investors, we like to say that this has probably a low teens to mid-teens CAGR, something around 14%. We calculate over the next 10 to 15 years. I mean, that's a pretty durable growth trajectory. It's very hard to find in any other particular sector at the moment. And a lot of that has to do with both defense, as the entire suite of, weapons systems essentially recalibrates towards this new technology, but it's also going to be, 3 or 4 other use cases, whether that's industrial, whether that's last mile delivery, whether that's going to be human transportation. There's some really, pretty amazing and durable themes that are going to drive the growth of this. Yeah, you certainly should be in it for the earnings leverage that is happening in the defense sector right now, but you can buy and hold this theme, for a good period of time and capture, a pretty strong growth trajectory.
Yeah, I want to get into some of the other use cases other than defense, but before we do, the asymmetry story in defense alone is fascinating, right? Iran is sending $50,000 drones, and it costs us millions per interceptor, right? Is that a structural tailwind you lead with when you're talking to allocators about the space? Like, a very cheap drone could do something very effective, and it could be very expensive to defend against it. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it is truly, revolutionizing warfare in the same way that the tank revolutionized warfare, in the mid 20th century. And to your point, Ukraine was really and still is, unfortunately, the laboratory for this particular technology. I mean, if you take even a step back even further, what's really interesting about it is that drones are not that new. I mean, they've been around actually since kind of early warfare. The British invented it, and they were using radio controlled drones as like training exercise vehicles to shoot down and test their anti-aircraft systems. And so since then, the drone in military has been kind of plane sized, and we saw it like in the Iraq War, and then further on in kind of the Afghanistan conflicts, where everyone knows what the Reaper drone is, and it's just kind of almost like mini aircraft size, and it was being piloted from remote air bases, even in the United States. And then on the flip side of that, you had toy drones, the Chinese kind of microelectronic revolution, very strong manufacturing, that miniaturized drones into kind of kids' toys, and between those two things, Ukraine now took them and put them together in a very gruesome laboratory that has the average drone now down around $400, which can disable a $3 to $5 million armored vehicle, depending on what it is. So fast forward into Iran. Iran obviously has unfortunately a very strong drone manufacturing base themselves, and they've been to your point, showing how they can use those to fight extremely expensive weapon systems, mostly air defense missiles. So where do we go from here? Well, we go from here into counter drone CUAS technology. And if you think about how many soft targets there are in the world that are now going to have to be fortified using some sort of either jamming or direct kinetic device to stop drones, the market opportunity is massive. And this fund, we have a few counter drone companies in the fund. Like I mentioned earlier, the Australian sector has been really robust in this area. And if anything, the CAGR in counter drone is probably higher than the CAGR in drone when you think about how much defensive capability has to be deployed worldwide now. So it's it's really an incredible revolution in how we battle.
So I wanted to pivot, but you bring up an interesting point with counter drones. And one thing people don't really realize, let's take the World Cup is coming here to the United States, right? And if for whatever reason a drone was heading into a populated area, you know, you can't just shoot them down. It is, in and or around a stadium. So you have to be able to get these things disabled and being able to like hit the ground without hurting people. And so, can you talk about some of the interesting things that are maybe going on in the counter drone space that is keeping our cities, our stadiums, and overall our people safe, to make sure that a $400 drone flown by a bad actor can be intercepted and safely.
Yeah, I mean, it's a scary scenario. To your point, whether it's going to be a sporting event, just recently you saw in the Baltic states, Russia fly a very small drone into, I think it was an Estonian power plant, which then set off alarm bells across NATO countries that aren't even militarized. Right now, all of a sudden, they're saying to themselves, okay, I need to start allocating defense budget to, soft targets like infrastructure and you name it. So, and we had another incursion in the United States. There's someone we still don't know who flew drones into our air base. I would believe it was in Louisiana where we house, long range nuclear, capable bombers. So yeah, this is a big deal. And so what do you do? I think that you wouldn't take necessarily like direct drone to drone impact off the table. I mean, you have to do what you have to do. But some of the more interesting things we've seen, the Australian company Drone Shield uses essentially like a jamming device. So they use high frequency waves, whether they're radio waves or other, to essentially disable the comms on a drone to the point where it destabilizes and falls. We've seen direct laser to drone, high intensity laser systems. They're still nascent, but there are a couple companies that are experimenting with those. I think the United States government might even be using those on the border. There was a kind of famous example where we shot down a weather balloon using, high intensity lasers, thinking it was a drone incursion, from cartels. So there's a lot of different systems, that can essentially do the same job cheaper than a missile and, hopefully with less impact, like you say, around, say, a civilian target. But Drone Shield in particular, that's in the portfolio. They use, radio jamming devices. It seems to be very effective. This is going to be, unfortunately, this is going to be like a long cat and mouse game, right? And people are going to be, countermeasures have been, a hallmark of military strategy since, missiles were invented. So we will invent counter drones, and then they will come up with ways to unfortunately come around that, and then we'll come up with ways to counter that. So for the investor, it's a durable trend. For the citizen, it's probably not the most
So
wonderful
let's
news.
talk about let's get off of defense. We talked about it enough. I know that there's a lot going on there, but there's a lot of other cool stuff that is in the portfolio that isn't defense. So there's things like logistics, agriculture, infrastructure inspection, AI, industrial automation. So what are you actually seeing real commercial revenue traction from right now in some of these other non-defense companies?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a good place to start with that is kind of at the industrial side, where we're seeing current revenue and real, use cases in the agriculture sector. I mean, there's probably about $3 billion worth of recurring revenue in ag using drones for, let's just say, crop application, inspection, various types of ag uses. Drones are now powerful enough that they can carry payload, pretty heavy fertilizer payload that can be then applied over large areas. So that's exciting. I mean, when you think about it, I think the average age of the U.S. farmers, north of 40 something, getting older. And that's true across a lot of industrial sectors in North America. You just have an aging population that's not necessarily being replaced in all these various critical resource industries. And so the ability to deploy drones to do that work is really exciting. And then the other kind of broader piece about industrial drone use is that it's enhanced by AI. Unlike a lot of sectors where AI will, be disruptive, this is actually an enhancing feature to it. So when you add AI to inspection drone, now all of a sudden you become, as powerful as, say, 10 inspectors on a tower, versus, say, one drone with high sensing capability and AI. So that's very exciting. What we're really looking for, though, as a catalyst in the space is the new line of sight rules by the FAA. And this BVLOS rulemaking is going to come out any day now, which is a great catalyst for the space. And this essentially means that what used to be a very intensive waiver-driven process in order to fly a drone over the line of sight will now become streamlined in certain corridors with certain rules and much smoother application processes. So you're going to really see a lot more industrial use cases for drones, whether it's pipelines or land surveying or repair. It really opens up a huge amount of space for people to start using this technology, profitably in the industrial sector.
So you took the next question right from me, which was, the BVLOS rules are just coming out, as you just said. We've got 26 state flying taxi testing. How quickly does regulatory progress like that how quickly can it change the composition of the fund or the size of the investable universe?
That's going to be an interesting, process to watch, because at the moment, if you look at our top 10 holdings, in the fund, they still are heavily, geared towards defense spend. There's no doubt about it. With the exception of, say, EHang, which is a Chinese company that's going into the eVTOL space. We can talk about eVTOL in a minute, but last mile delivery, that has come a lot faster than I expected in this space. Amazon's obsession with density and trying to cut costs, and that has clearly been, the biggest cost factor is just high cost, low density, last mile delivery. And the ability to do it with a drone is, just game changing. And so then you layer in, all sorts of different kind of use cases there, and then everyone else to start following Amazon's lead. Walmart is kind of close in their tail. And so I just see the ability for, someone in that space to move into the top 10 is probably within the next year or two. Just like you say, with so many of these experiments going on. And then, eVTOL as the last piece of this, like, also surprising to me. I mean, I honestly, we've kind of kept this as like a maybe in 10 years we'll be flying in air taxis, but I would not be surprised if in certain major cities you see people going from the airport to, hubs in, I don't know, say Houston or a few other places, within a year or two using, full blown, eVTOL systems. And that's pretty awesome. Yeah, that's it. I'm really excited to give that a shot. I think that's just super
I
cool.
was joking with my wife. There was, you could buy one of your own personal quads. And I'm like, wouldn't this be great to just like take back and forth I think we're going to see too, like if this actually happens, because it feels a little Jetsony to me, there's all this infrastructure that just doesn't exist. It's going to have to be built. You're going to have, as you said, we'll take a city hub like, I don't know, New York, for example. Right now, if you wanted to get into the city very quickly, you get off the airplane and maybe you take a Blade helicopter over and, it lands over there on the, there's, I think 2 or 3 different locations where they land. So there's all this additional infrastructure that it might need to be built just to handle, drone taxis.
I mean, the point-to-point use cases from a like, let's just say like a Waymo perspective, it's interesting. I haven't heard them necessarily discuss this yet. So I'm a little bit surprised by that. But, when you layer autonomous technology into this, and then you start to kind of map what you can do, with it. And then like you mentioned, cities like New York, anywhere you have a, 50-minute ride from the airport to the center of the city, is up for grabs. And so I would absolutely think that there are going to be companies that specialize in building out that kind of drone specific infrastructure, whether it's landing pads, whether it's, various types of scheduling technologies. I don't know, back in the day, you used to be able to land on top of, I think it was called the Pan Am building, which is now in that Life building, right at 42nd Street, Grand Central. I mean, people used to land on the roof, right? Like that was the kind of promise of the space age, was that you'd have this, incredible mobility through the sky. And I think we're going to get back to that. I don't think it'll be limited to just heliports, deep downtown. I think you're going to see, a whole new kind of ecosystem evolve in cities where you can go from, rooftop to rooftop and so on. So it's pretty wild, but okay. And look, I'll throw a little more more interesting use case as well on top of this, which is medical and first responders. You're starting to see certain departments get access to eVTOLs for like deep in-country rescue. But would it surprise you, if in the next 5 years every municipality had a sky ambulance? I mean, it's pretty awesome, and I think that would be a very cool and beneficial use case for the technology to have, people be able to get to you, faster and better.
So if anybody hasn't picked up on it by now, the drone space is moving really, really fast. And I noticed you guys are publishing a weekly drone kind of market research report on the website. Is that kind of content marketing part of the distribution strategy, or is it more about like really, I don't want to say establishing credibility? You guys have credibility in the space, but I mean, it moves so fast. It's almost necessary to educate people as everything changes so quickly.
That's exactly the point. I think that we really felt like if we kept this to a monthly or quarterly cadence, people would feel very far behind on what was happening in the space. And so we try to get judiciously information out there, even on a daily basis, that we might see in the market, through X. And we certainly are trying to make that newsletter a must-read piece of the sector flow. We found that not a lot of people are really publishing in the space, or really, talking too much or aggregating information, across these different verticals. And so we're trying to just create a central repository of information where people who, may be interested in the sector, maybe already invested in the fund, can feel like that they're staying on top of, to your point in the very beginning of this episode, the news flow is just so rapid. And it's just, I think it's important to know where the drivers of performance are coming from, and we're going to try to keep you on top of those with the flow.
So last thing would be, you got leverage, you've got crypto, you've got income, you've got thematic. Is the idea to go deeper there, or are you still looking at, other gaps in the market, and we could see, additional things that don't maybe fit those couple criteria?
I think for the moment, I think it's taking those categories and going deeper. Never say never that, we might do something completely adjacent when it comes. But again, like, it's about keeping our finger on the pulse of the market, seeing where demand is going, what people want. For now, this is what we think people want. And we're going to try to then kind of go deeper into those individual verticals, and build out some new and exciting things. I know in particular, the thematic space, is still very nascent for us. And so we have some ideas kicking around that we think are going to be exciting, hopefully as exciting as this drones product. Just interesting, forward-looking, thoughtful, but always with an eye towards, high growth rates, things that we think are durable.
Well, again, Bill, thank you for spending some time with me today. Before I let you go, where can people learn more about Rex and get all the information they need on DRNZ?
Absolutely. So if you go to our website, Rexfin, you can sign up for this newsletter, stay on top of the drone space. Certainly follow us on Twitter. You can, get all of our various addresses there. I myself am on Twitter, at Bill Birmingham. I will talk about crypto. I'll talk about drones, any other stuff in the market that is going on that I think is interesting. And there's certainly a lot these days. So no, I really appreciate this opportunity to talk about our funds and talk about this one in particular. As you can see, I'm pretty excited about it. I like the drone space quite a bit. I think it's just a really, kind of interesting and, very cool sector that, hopefully we'll all be flying around in drones, very soon.
Yeah, I hope so. I want my own flying taxi. And I agree. The drone sector is, you and I kind of, when we first met here a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about drones, and a big part of my portfolio has been in drones. And so I agree with you. I think the space is super exciting. But again, Bill, thanks for being here with me today.
Thanks again. Take care.